Hello everyone, I'm back with another video. I haven't made a video in a while. That seems to be a general theme of most of my videos is me saying I haven't made a video in a while. But what better way to get back into it than with I think this is the third video of anti-chess tutorials. So I think this is part three at the time of this recording, if I'm correct. And basically today, I literally have no time to lose because I'm going to be going over every single 1v1 or every single two major piece endgame in anti-chess. So I do not have any time to waste here. This is just a welcome chapter. This study will be on Lichess. There's 37 chapters, complete with every single endgame. I'm pretty sure every single, at least every single exception that I could think of, um, in these endgames, along with 10 puzzles at the end that we might get to in this video, but I literally don't have any time to waste. And also, by the way, I just wanted to add that the International Anti-Chess Federation now has a Twitch channel. I'm pretty sure YouTube channel as well, but mainly I know the Twitch channel is getting a lot bigger, which I generally stream on with one of or last week I streamed with Kex and Penny on that channel. It's mostly Fridays because that's when a weekly or a monthly tournament will be on, and so we'll give our commentary there. And along with those guys, we have some pretty good ideas, some pretty good, and we have pretty good general knowledge of the game. So I feel like it would be beneficial if you're ever around or if you're interested to go watch that. I will put a link in the description, but for the Twitch channel, it's literally just IAF Anti-Chess. Um, but anyways, let's get started with the every single endgame uh, in anti-chess or 1v1 endgame in anti-chess video. Quick note is that I did make a King's endgame video for anti-chess a while ago, but I think doing this updated version, especially for anti-chess tutorials, is going to be a lot more helpful. And it's just another place where it's just like if you need any endgame, then you can come here. You can watch the video to see my explanation, or you can just go to the video and then click the link on the study and find it on Lichess. But anyways, let's get going right away. I think we start with the king endgames, just because they're fairly simple. The king is a fairly simple piece. It can move one square in every direction, and because of the nature of the king this way, um, uh, king versus king is always a draw because there's no way the king can get close enough so that another king captures. Because, for example, if you move any one square closer from this sort of two square in between distance from the king, if you move one square closer, then the other king just sacrifices right away. So, oh, is it black to move? Yeah, it's black to move. So really, you can't do much other than just you're moving back and forth. I guess, yeah. There's not much to be done here. You can move out here, but as you see, there's always this amount of space, and if any king ever moves close enough, then the other king will just sacrifice. So this game is completely a draw. Um, I'll move on to the next one. We got king versus rook endgames, and this endgame is 100% of the time, if played correctly, a win for the rook. And the reason why is because the rook can just control so much more space than the king, and it sort of forces it eventually. Oh, yeah, okay, Lichess doesn't draw arrows like that, but eventually forces the king in the corner while your rook is on the c6, f6, c3, or f3 squares. Um, and the king being in the corner, there's no way it can move without the rook sacrificing. So the main idea for this is to keep your rook this distance away from the king. And if it ever moves up one square, then I can follow it that way. If it moves to the side one square, you can also follow the king that way. And it's just sort of now the king only has this amount of space to move. Um, in this case, to delay the mate as long as possible, the king is better to move diagonally because this forces the rook to move onto this square or this square, so it can't move directly onto the square in front of the or diagonal to the king. Um, and so in this case, if we move here, then the king can gain some opposition like this. And so the rook rather has to move. You can move over here, uh, and then the king has to start moving back this way again, or you can just move back two squares or three squares, um, and so like I could move here, and after the king moves back, the rook can come back and be those amount of squares away from the king again. The reason I don't suggest this move, of course, it's winning. Oh, I should keep those on. The reason I don't suggest this square is because although winning, it's just like you're just sort of wasting the move because the king can keep the opposition there. And then you could obviously go back, but you might as well just end the game faster. But anyways, yeah, so as soon as the rook moves, say for example to a5, then we're just following the king again, forcing it into this corner now. King e7, we move the rook, and then after king f8, this is impossible for black to win. However, you have to be careful as the white rook. You want to be forcing the king to stay on the bottom rank. If you move somewhere like here, oh, I also forgot to mention that. Oh wait, did I? The red moves are bad moves, green moves are good moves, and I'm pretty sure blue moves, if there are blue moves in this video, I generally use blue moves to show defensive moves or restricting moves. But anyways, if the rook moves here, then the king can move uh, uh, back up one of the ranks, and then this forces the rook to move again. The king once again ends up on the 7th rank. So in this case, it is fairly important to play this. This forces the king to stay on the 8th rank, and even after the opposition is gained, we can just play rook to g6, and now the king has to move all the way across the board with the rook following once again. And then finally, after rook to c6, oh, sorry, you can't see me there. Um, yeah, blue arrow, so this restricts the king. The king can't move anywhere, so the rook will obviously win. Moving on, we got king versus bishop now. This is a draw almost every single time. There's very few exceptions. However, there are some winning chances for the bishop. I've noticed that even players up to 1900 ranks rated sometimes don't understand these endgames, and so sometimes you can win although it is a draw. Um, the important thing for the king is to not end up with the bishop and the king reversed in this position. If the bishop is here and the king is here, the bishop cuts off all squares from the king, and any way that the king moves, the bishop will be able to sacrifice there. So it's just about that. So for example, king d5 is fine. Like any of these moves are fine at this point. Bishop h5. The reason I like a move like this is it just sort of forces uh, well, in this case, it's the only move. But it also forces the king to sort of stay in this area. So say we have king e5. This just and the bishop just comes back to e2. This forces the king once again to stay in this sort of area. So you're just sort of containing it. We go back to d6. That's fine. The bishop. This is a much easier move for the bishop because the bishop can just follow it this way, and this is the exact space that you want to keep when going down to the bottom rank. But anyway, say we play king e7, the bishop follows, and the big thing that most players mess up here is they'll move their king to one of these squares. And obviously, um, if the king moves to d8, then you have bishop d5, and then all of a sudden, oh, the arrow's already drawn for me. I forgot I did that. But now the king is cut off of all squares. There's nothing that can be done. And if we go back to this position and the king moves to f8, then bishop f5 will be sufficient at trapping the king. So the very important move here is to play king e8 because now the bishop can't really move to any of these squares because it loses, and so the bishop just has to move to one place or another. So we could have bishop b7, for example, but then after king e7 and the bishop comes back, you just move your king back again. There's nothing else to be done here. Um, and so yeah, so this is a drawn endgame, but there are certainly winning chances for the bishop. Now we have king versus queen. The queen is actually this endgame, if not win for the king immediately, like if you can't just move your king one square and then the queen has to capture it. The queen is actually way more efficient than the rook. However, most people generally choose the rook because if they have enough time, it's much easier not to make a mistake. Obviously, on the diagonals, it's tough to judge sometimes with diagonal it's slicing down. But anyways, the idea is sort of the similar idea as the rook. It's to trap it in the corner. For example, if we play king a5 here, the important thing to note now is the fact that when our rook is here, we sort of trap the king from here. But with the queen's diagonal movements, we can block the king off of these squares immediately. So the king can't move in any of these squares. It's just significantly faster. So say we have king g3, you can once again follow the king like this. And the nice thing about the queen is if the king moves diagonally one square that way, the queen can also move diagonally one square that way. After king h1, and queen to d3. This cuts off the king of all squares. So king versus queen, queen will win. And anyways, we get to king versus knight now. Um, and this is most of the time a win for the king. There are a couple exceptions though, which I will be sure to go through. Um, the best tactic here is just to force the knight to run out of space because the king moves much more efficiently and much more effectively. So after king e2, you can play knight e6, but after you just move the king sideways like one square or another, the knight obviously can't move forward. So say we move back to c7, king just moves up the board. And after knight e8, and king e4, there's no other squares. The knight will have to move to one of these squares, and the king will be able to sacrifice sufficiently there. I'll just undraw these arrows real quick. So yeah, it's not that complicated. It's just about bringing your king as close to the knight, but the knight will eventually run out of squares. This is the first exception of king versus knight, and it's basically the fact that when the king is directly attacked on a certain square, like say on h5, it has to move the next move. So like it will have to move away from a certain square. If we have a king on e1, obviously it can't stay there. If it's your only piece left, then obviously you have to move away. And the knight can actually take advantage of this sometimes. I gotta stop drawing arrows for no reason. For example, if we play king h6 in this position, all of these blue moves draw the game because of king promotion. King to g6 is the only move that wins it. But if we play king to h6, however, knight promotion wins the game because the knight attacks these two squares, but obviously the king has to move off of this square. And anywhere the king moves, the knight will be able to sacrifice itself. If it moves here, if it moves to g7 or h7, like it just has to move away from the square. And it's really a beautiful exception. And so yeah. So anyways, we get to part three. Knight should be promoted to here for black. However, most people mispromote to king because they think, oh, king versus knight endgame. I just promote to king and then I can force the knight to run out of squares. But in this case, if you can find it in a couple seconds, the knight actually has a win here after knight to e4. Because the king is sort of trapped in the corner. You obviously can't move to any of these squares because the knight blocks it off. So having your knight in the center of the board and the king in the corner will be a win for the knight. So that's the second exception here. But that's it for the king endgames. We are now moving on to rook endgames. And some of these are kind of simple. Like for example, in this chapter, I'm just going over the fact that the side to play wins the game because obviously both rooks can reach any file or rank on the board. And the exact same is true about king versus queen. Sorry, rook versus queen endgames. Side to play just immediately wins. But anyways, moving on, rook versus knight endgames. Due to the nature of the knight actually has to move off of the same file and rank every time. So if the knight is on b7, for example, it cannot, after the next move, be on either the b file or the 7th rank, and the rook can take advantage of this. So say we move to d6 with the knight. Rook d1 wins the game. Also, rook g6 wins the game. I don't know. I guess I could put that there. But because after you move your rook here, the knight obviously has to move away from the d file. So the rook ends up winning against the knight in this case, just due to the fact that the knight is it has to move off that file / rank. Moving on though, we have another sort of exception with the knight because the knight is such a strange piece. The rook has 5 losing moves in this position. Obviously, like some of them are really simple to see, like this. Um, yeah, some of them are really simple to see like that. But then there's a couple more. There's this move, and this move that also lose, which we will get to later. But we're going to start with rook b6. And the reason this loses is because of knight promotion. The knight attacks both of these two squares, the b6 and the c7 square, and because the rook can't move diagonal, it can't sacrifice there, and because the knight is directly attacking the rook here, the rook has to move away from this b6 square, in which the knight will be able to sacrifice. So say the rook moves to h6, then obviously the knight can come back and sacrifice itself there. And so yeah, so now we're moving on to rook versus bishop endgames. Obviously, in this part, the side to play wins. It's not that complicated to see. If it's the rook side to play, then obviously we're going to play rook f5, and otherwise we're going to play bishop f5 if it's the bishop's play. Um, but the bishop actually works the exact same way as the knight. For example, when after the rook has to capture here, the bishop has to move off of this file slash and has to move off of the d file while also moving off the seventh rank. So the rook can attack it the same way it attacks the knight, and the bishop has to move away. So then the rook can slide in to the square that the bishop had previously occupied. So that works the exact same. Hopefully you understand that concept. So I'm going to be moving on because obviously I've got to be moving quick here. Um, but part three for this rook versus bishop endgame. This is an interesting puzzle. If you want to take a moment to try to figure it out, it is white's move right here. You can choose h4 or h3. Um, which is really interesting, and it has all to do with rook versus bishop exceptions. If you chose to play h4, um, you are incorrect. And here's the reason why. You actually don't want to promote first. The promoting first is here is what loses. Say we play h4. If you want, you can try to figure this out. I should have suggested that before. But after the pieces move up the board, like so, um, your white piece, you're not going to promote to bishop or queen because you'll have to take it. If you promote to king, obviously black's going to promote to a rook and win the game. If you promote to knight, then black's obviously going to promote to a king and win the game. Or a bishop, which we'll get to later. So obviously you're going to think, okay, I'm going to promote a rook. But then black has this amazing exception, bishop promotion, because the bishop attacks this square of the rook, and the rook cannot move into another place that the bishop attacks because the bishop attacks all these center squares. So in this case, you would lose the game if you play h4. However, if you play h3 instead, after we advance our pieces up the board, you're in the exact same position except black has to move first. And so in this case, black would promote to rook, and then bishop promotion is winning here. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Same thing sort of happens when the rook is on any of these squares. The rook has to move off the square, of course, and then the bishop re-attacks it. So those are all the rook endgames and exceptions that I'll be looking into today. But moving on, we've now got the queen endgames. This one's pretty standard. Decide to play wins. I don't think that's that difficult to see. We also have queen and knight endgames. This is a lot of mess, but this is just to show that all the red squares are places where the queen loses. All the green squares are where the queen wins. So it's just to show that there are several different places that the queen can move to win and lose, of course. But the easiest ones I feel like to see in my mind are queen e1 or queen e4, or I guess all of them are fairly easy to see except for something like queen h3 or queen b1. And these are, like, for example, this move is just because now the knight has to make an extra move. And then you can sacrifice next move. So it's the same number of mates, but something like queen e1 is just way simpler. It's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing as the rook. The knight has to move off of this file, and so you're obviously winning here. And next we'll go to queen versus bishop. Of course, in this one again, side to play wins. Obviously, this d6 square is shared by both pieces, so whatever side will play first does win. However, with this exception, same sort of exception as the rook, the bishop obviously has to move off of this the e file and the eighth rank. However, this is a little bit trickier, obviously, or I've got to stop saying obviously. But if the queen is on the same colored square as the bishop, say it was on e2 instead, the bishop could still sacrifice on a white square because the queen moves diagonally. So it is important to note that the queen needs to be on an opposite colored square, but other than that, it still works. It still works sort of the same way as the rook. And now we're going to get into the bishop endgames. Or because we've gone through so many endgames, we're going to be moving into the bishop versus bishop endgames and bishop versus knight endgames before going to knight versus knight. Bishop versus bishop part one. Once again, very simple. The side to play wins. They're both on the same colored square, so they can obviously share multiple squares, or sometimes only one square, I think. Um, but in this case, yes, the side to play wins, as there are multiple squares that can be reached by the same piece. Um, and so, following that, bishop versus bishop. In this case, when they're opposite color, this game is immediately a draw. And even on Lee chess, they'll end the game right there and just call it a draw. They won't make you play it out, like for example, king versus king, as there's still a mistake to be made. In this case, the bishops are on opposite color squares, and because they can only stay on these color squares, there is no possible way to capture the opponent's bishop, and there's no way to force your opponent to capture your bishop. So this game is just immediately a draw. Um, and so now moving on to bishop versus knight endgames. Say for in this position, obviously, if you promote king, you're losing because the bishop just moves to f7. Rook will lose because you're just gonna move your bishop to e6. Bishop loses and queen loses for the same reason on f7 or e6. So you might think knight promotion is strong. However, because the knight has to move away from its rank and its file, and also onto a different color every single move. Something like bishop f7 is sufficient here because the knight has to move off of this white square, and because it moves onto a dark square, obviously, shoot, I gotta stop saying obviously. Because it moves onto a dark square, the bishop will not be able to. The bishop will not have to capture it in any way, shape, or form because it is on a dark square and the bishop has to stay on the light square. So the knight will move off it and then sacrificing on e8 will win the game. For this next exception, all promotions here will lose immediately except for bishop. For example, knight promotion, it's just one move. Same thing with queen promotion or rook promotion or king promotion, just like that. And so one might think bishop promotion is the way to go. Obviously, I can just move my bishop to attack the knight next move. But the knight has a tricky move here, and being in the center of the board while the bishop's on the end of the board, the bishop actually has no moves because the knight is so centralized that the bishop, whenever, because it can, first of all, it can't attack the knight immediately because the knight is on a dark square. But now, no matter where the bishop moves, because the knight is so centralized, the knight will be able to sacrifice itself the next turn or the next move. And so the bishop has no safe squares in this case, and this is the first exception in which the knight does win. And the third exception is because this is becoming a common theme, is the fact that most pieces or all pieces have to move on. They can't end up on the same square after one turn. And so in this case, for example, after the knight moves to h7, the bishop has to move away from this f8 square, and this is the only square that the knight is attacking that both the bishop can control as well. And so the bishop will have to move off or away from f8, where the knight can sacrifice next move. And finally, we have the knight versus knight endgame. And this one's actually really, this knight versus knight has always been really interesting to me. In this case, when they're both on the white squares, the side to play wins the game. This is because the super unique nature of the knight. Because it moves onto a different color each time, for example. So next move, it will move on black and then white again, then black again, then white again. And the important thing to note here is because the white knight is moving on to the dark square first, um, and the black knight will have to move on to the dark square second. That means no matter what, this dark knight will have to capture the white knight because there's no way the white knight will end up on a colored square after the dark knight will. For example, after knight c3, there's just no possible way for black to win. So, for example, say we have a knight to g7. You can even pre-move these for this knight because there's no possible way that the dark knight can end up on a square before the white knight because we're moving on to a white square now with the white knight. And after this move, say we play knight to e8 here, either of these moves will be sufficient at winning, simply because the white knight is sort of always one square ahead of the dark knight. So in this case, knight d6 would obviously win the game. So those are all of the end games and main exceptions I can think of. And so I have a couple puzzles set up. In this case, in this video, I'd really suggest you to some of these aren't incredibly advanced. I tried to make 5 beginner puzzles, 3 intermediate puzzles, and 2 advanced puzzles. But even the advanced puzzles, like you could definitely figure them out when if you look at them long enough. But it's just sort of to get you in the mindset if you haven't seen some of these end games before to try to think about it. So in this video, I'll show you the position, and I'll give you a couple seconds. You can pause the video whenever you want, obviously, and you can take as much time as you need. You can set it up. You can set it up on your own board or something like that. But I also challenge you to try to find it as fast as you can. And there's certain there's a couple interesting puzzles in here. So we're gonna start out with the beginner ones. Puzzle one. You've got oh, I also forgot to mention that in every single puzzle it will be white to play just for the sake of simplicity. So it is your move, and once you found it, you'll understand that the correct move is knight e7. Once again, taking advantage of the fact that the king has to move away from the only square the knight attacks near it. Obviously, it can't move to c6, which is another square that the knight attacks somewhat near it. And so in this case, the correct move was knight e7. Moving on now, we've got puzzle 2. We've got a bishop versus a king. Endgame here. If you want to take a minute to pause, a minute to think about it. But the correct move here, the only winning move here, is bishop to h5. This cuts off the square, the king of all squares. And although it's not in the center of the board, like although it's not bishop here and king here, it still works the same way because they're still the same distance away. In this case, it's just the fact that the king can't move to the right, but there's no problem about that. It still just cuts off the king completely of getting back into the game. So moving on now, we've got puzzle 3. We looked at this position for the knight moving here. We didn't look at either of these 2 moves, but hopefully you can figure out the correct promotion here. Once you figure it out as quickly as you can, is bishop promotion. The rook has to move away from this diagonal because it moves only up and sideways and in left and right. I should redraw some of these arrows back. But yeah, so that's the correct move. And after rook a6, you're obviously going to play, that one is obvious, you're obviously going to play a bishop to c6. Anyways, moving on, puzzle 4. Um, uh, the correct move here for those who still haven't found out is knight promotion because the knight attacks the rook square. The rook has to move off that square. So for example, rook to h7, your only move is knight f7, and you win the game. Moving on to puzzle 5 now. There are several winning moves, but for example, let's try to find the 3 fastest moves. I'm assuming that most of you found rook to h8 or rook to c1. If you wanted to be fancy here, you could also play rook to h5 because if the knight's on the 8th rank, then it will obviously have to move up and attack this square the next turn. But rook c1 is what I have in this study, and after rook c1, the knight has to move away, and you win the game. Now we're moving on to puzzle 6, the intermediate puzzle. Once again, I will remind you that I will put this study in the description. If any of you are interested, this will be public as of the time that the video goes out on YouTube. But anyways, I really like this puzzle because this puzzle, it says you only have 1 second left in the game. What is the safest promotion? And I really want to emphasize that you only have 1 second left in the game. And if you found this move, then good job, you're a very smart critical thinker. I would not suggest king in this case. Reason being is because if you only have 1 second, your opponent might be able to pre-move it out or make you mess up because you have extremely little time. I think the correct move in this case when you only have 1 second left is knight promotion because you can literally pre-move anywhere you want. Because the black knight will have to move onto the light square after you, and you'll be 1 square ahead. You can pre-move wherever you want. You can move wherever you want. It is impossible for you to lose the game if you promote knight here. And so in this case, the correct move was e8 equals knight. Puzzle 7 now. We got this sort of setup. You can advance your e pawn or your h pawn, and as most of you will see, advancing the h pawn is important because after rook takes, you are going to promote to bishop, moving the rook off of this square. For example, rook h5, bishop e5, and you win the game. We've now got puzzle 8, an intermediate puzzle, once again, so like sort of a difficult puzzle. You got a couple seconds to think about it, but the correct move is knight promotion. You had to promote to something. Reason knight promotion is correct is now after the king captures, you have this splendid move of knight to g6. The king has to move off the square. I should draw in this arrow as well, and you win the game. So good job. We've got 2 advanced puzzles left. I love this puzzle in particular. It's such a nice puzzle. Your first move is really crazy, and it is. Oh, I psyched all of you out because you thought it was going to be a pawn move, but it's actually knight to g5. Obviously, the king's not going to move in any of these squares because they will lose in 2 moves. So the king's going to move down here. And the next whopper of a move to see this move is good, but to see this move is now to do the same thing once again, force the king away from the square in the corner. And this is because, for example, the best move here is king h7. You can sacrifice here on h6 and then promote to rook because the king will be up there. But the faster way to do it is to play knight h8, and after the king takes, you have the incredible bishop promotion, cutting the king off of all these squares right here. Obviously, the king cannot move to any of these squares, so it's just really incredible to see knight g5, and then once the king moves away, to keep the king in the corner once again. It's more about keeping the king, forcing the king to stay in the corner, and after this bishop promotion, you win the game. And finally, we've got the final advanced puzzle, and this one's actually not that advanced. I just thought it was so cool that I had to show it. Because wait a minute, I have a feeling another. Oh wait, never mind. Um, Obviously, by deductive reasoning, or inductive reasoning, I forget which one. But you're not going to promote to rook because of one rook sacrificing after another. Same thing with the queen promotion. With king promotion, I'm going to be going over larger endgames in the future, but king promotion, you're going to lose. Your opponent has 2 rooks. They can even use their rooks individually and beat you. Knight promotion loses immediately because of, for example, rook g7 and then rook to g2, forcing the knight off of that square. So the correct move here, surprisingly, is bishop promotion. And this looks really complex, but basically what it's just saying is after rook to g6, bishop takes, the rook has to move away from this diagonal now, which is just exceptional. Dang it. Well, that sucks. All my arrows are gone, but that's okay. And if rook to c6, now this rook would have to move off of this diagonal, and it's game over either way. And so yeah, so thank you everyone for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. I will put the link once again in the description for both this study, and I will also put a link in the description to I'll also put a link in the description to the IAF Antichess Twitch. And other than that, thank you for watching. I hope you are enjoying the coverage of this Antichess tutorial series. I will see you later and have an excellent rest of your day. Bye.